Hi everyone, I'm Professor Janice Kay, Provost at the University of Exeter. I'm pleased to see so many of you this afternoon to take part in the debate and question and answer focused on tackling gender-based violence. We're going to do this together. Many of you are members of our students and staff community, and we also welcome colleagues from Bath and Plymouth universities, the NHS, local support charities, police and city and county councils. Gender-based violence is a major issue for every single one of us. With the recent instances of violence against women and girls, including many in our local area, we're keen as a university to bring together various partners and agencies who support people who've suffered violence and harm, and to play a key role in prevention. Our aim with today's event and our continuing work on gender-based violence is to recognise a broad spectrum of experiences, including those of Black, Asian, minority ethnic and trans women, who can often face additional abuse or barriers due to intersectional identities. In our university, we work in partnership with our students' unions and external organisations to try to ensure that every single member of our community feels safe by doing what we can to reduce instances of gender-based violence, and by ensuring that people who are harmed receive the best, most empathic care with support to report any instance. We also want to facilitate an ongoing dialogue and increase awareness about these issues across all members of our community, because we believe that the more we speak out openly, the safer our campuses and communities will be for all. We know that many of us have had these experiences and that these are difficult, sensitive and potentially upsetting topics, and we need to look after ourselves and each other. Please do feel free to step away at any time for a break if that's helpful. And please also do reach out for support if you need it. With the joining instructions for today, you will have received information of the support services available as well. We've got a remarkable panel of experts with us today who are national and local leaders, including some of our own staff and students. Let me tell you a little bit about the event. We will start with our keynote, then our panel will introduce themselves and their work. These introductions will end with Dr. Rachel Fenton, who will speak for 15 minutes about the pyramid of abuse. Then we'll open it up to your questions. So without further ado, I am really very delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Jess Phillips, MP, the Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. Jess has been a long-standing advocate for better support for victims of violence, from her work over 10 years ago for the Women's Aid Federation of England to her membership of the House of Commons Women and Equalities Committee. Her maiden speech to Parliament concerned homelessness and improving Britain's response to victims of domestic and sexual violence and abuse in all its forms. And she has been a key voice in Parliament on the development of the new domestic abuse bill. Jess, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Exeter University, and I would like now to hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Janice. And first of all, I am in Westminster at the moment, and so if you hear a bell ringing behind me, don't panic. It's not a fire. It is. I was about to say it'll be for a vote, but we don't even do that anymore. But bells intermittently ring all the time in Westminster, so don't be alarmed if that happens. I've learnt to ignore it. So it's a pleasure to be with you all today, talking about gender-based violence and what we can all do. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about the national context. Janice has already mentioned the recently passed now Domestic Abuse Act, which took 4 years to get through Parliament and fell a number of different times because we just love to have elections in this country over the past 5 years. And so I'll talk a little bit about the bill, but also and what is good about it, but also the sort of huge gaps that are part of the big national conversation around violence against women and girls that still persist and still need huge amounts of activism and action to make it so that women, and it is fundamentally, I shall say from the get-go, whilst anybody can be a victim of domestic abuse or sexual violence. The vast majority of people who are victims of violence are women, and the vast majority of perpetrators are men. And I think to ignore that fact would not help us going forward in the future. So the domestic abuse bill is what keeps being described as a landmark piece of legislation, obviously by the government, and it over many years has massively improved thanks to the work of activists, victims, organisations who have worked tirelessly to ensure that the bill wasn't just a sort of checkbox exercise. Initially, the bill was intended to make a legal definition of domestic abuse on the statute books for the first time, which shockingly it hadn't existed before. There was no definition of domestic abuse in all of its forms written anywhere in statute prior to the Domestic Abuse Act. And when I say in all of its forms, I mean coercive control, financial abuse, the array of victims, including children. And that wasn't marked anywhere in legislation, and that is what the Domestic Abuse Act sought to do. And it sought to have a commissioner who would look over issues of domestic abuse in our country. That was pretty much its limit when it started out in its life as a draft bill in Parliament nearly 5 years ago. However, over many years, we, myself and others, worked very hard to ensure that service provision would actually be affected on the ground. When I first read the Domestic Abuse Act, I thought, well, what, you know, nobody in refuge, for the years I worked in refuge, no woman ever came up to me and said, do you know what I really want, Jess? I just really want domestic abuse to be better defined in law. That literally no one ever asked for that. What they said is, I want to be able to get my kid into a school when I've had to move house. I need to be able to find a home. I need, when I go forward to the police and to the courts, for them to believe me and for it to be taken seriously and acted on in a manner that is not traumatic. What women told me is that they wanted stuff for their kids. They wanted the family court system to be massively improved because the family court system in our country, and I'm afraid to say this persists but way beyond the Act, is the average layman on the street would have you believe that mothers are preferred in our family courts, and that when people separate, that a mother holds all the cards, and that is absolutely not borne out in the reality of victims of domestic abuse in our country, where the family courts are used very regularly by perpetrators of domestic abuse to continue control and abuse of both them and their children. And so these were the things that they wanted to see in the bill. They wanted to see a service and a belief. And so we worked incredibly hard over many years to amend the bill and build the bill. And to be fair to the government, they were open to most of the suggestions, and some of them they had to be forced into. But the bill as it stands today has a statutory duty for refuge accommodation to be provided by every Tier 1 local authority. Previously to the Domestic Abuse Act, the only things that local authorities had to provide by law were adult and children's services and bin services. And so now victims of domestic abuse matter as much as the bins. The day that they matter as much as the cars is the one where I might rest, but we're nowhere near that yet, politically speaking, but one day we might be. And the Domestic Abuse Act also changed some criminal legislation around things like non-fatal strangulation. A very common complaint of victims of domestic abuse is that strangulation is used, and it is one of the main precursors in the cases of homicide that we see, of men killing women. It's very, very, very common that non-fatal strangulation led up to that death in the long run, and so we have now got specific laws around non-fatal strangulation rather than it being considered a 6-month summary offence, which it was previously. Also widely advertised and widely spoken about was the issue of the rough sex defence, which has now been changed in law following a very high profile killing of a woman where her killer went, I can't say murderer, he was her killer. He went to prison for, well, in the time that we campaigned for the law, it took longer to campaign for the law than the time he served in prison. And he's now living free, and the defence that he used in court was that he'd killed her accidentally as part of a sex game that she had consented to. And we sought to struck that law off, that statutory defence off the record, and that also went into the bill. There's huge amounts of other stuff around domestic abuse protection orders that are specific, like restraining orders, that have gone into the bill. However, all of these things, any law change, and I will take my hat off to this government, the previous Conservative government under both Theresa May and David Cameron, that they have been absolutely brilliant at writing new laws, writing words that get stored on goat skin in the basement of the building that I am sat in is not something that they have struggled with. We have coercive control laws that we didn't have. We now have non-fatal strangulation. We have the Domestic Abuse Act. None of it means anything without the resource, training and outreach of people in the community. And if there is simply not the resource to be offering services, so for the first time ever, children are now considered to be direct victims of domestic abuse when they grow up in a domestic abuse situation, and still in 90% of our country there is zero services specifically for children who are living with domestic abuse. The resource matters, and writing down that somebody, like I say, no one in Refuge ever said, I just really wish it was written down somewhere that I mattered. What they wanted was a refuge bed. What they wanted was someone to talk to their children. And the reality is we are a long way off. The Domestic Abuse Act, it's not just not groundbreaking, it's barely dusting it with soil until we all, as organisations and institutions, do our bit to make sure that those laws are held up. It is, after all, illegal to murder people and rape them, and yet people do it all the time. So laws in and of themselves don't matter. We are in a national context of failure in huge areas of gender-based violence. The most obvious one is that of rape conviction. The most recent details from and data from the Home Office shows that only 1.6% of people who come forward to police forces, bearing in mind that will be a tiny tip of the iceberg. We consider it to be around 8% of all rapes that occur. But only 1.6% of those are charged, let alone convicted. You're talking even fewer go on to be convicted. So 1.6% of people who come forward will see their perpetrator charged, even fewer will see them convicted. And this has been a stubbornly difficult statistic for a long time, and yet we are seeing it worsening year on year. If such a thing, I remember when I first started in this line of work, it was around 6%, and I thought that was bad, and I have watched it degrade and degrade on and on. What is more, we have seen outpourings by women in our country following the Me Too movement, and also more recently the Sarah Everard killing. And what we have got to make sure is that those feelings, that sharing, that outpouring means something. So post the Me Too movement, where people were talking about sexual harassment and violence in their workplaces, that was what that was largely about what people had been putting up with in their workplaces. There isn't a single piece of legislation that has changed since the Me Too movement in our country. Non-disclosure agreements can still be are still regularly signed by powerful people in organisations who seek to silence people who come forward when they have been discriminated against on the basis of their gender and have been sexually assaulted and harassed at work. This is not, I sat once with the Health and Safety Executive on the committee where we looked into sexual harassment in the workplace, and I asked the Health and Safety Executive if they were aware of the thing that kills the most women at work. They couldn't answer, and I told them that it was domestic abuse that killed the most women at work. Women in, not last year, but the year before, 3 women were summarily executed whilst at their place of work. It is the sexual harassment and abuse is the single thing that women will say is making them sick at work. And it is a huge problem in our workplaces, and yet still, when I pressed the health and safety executive to ask what they were doing about it, they said that that was not in their remit. The health and safety of women in the workplace and the thing that makes us unsafe might not be harmful, flammable materials. It may very well be the people that we are working amongst, and nothing has changed in regard to the regulation in this area. With regards to rape and sexual violence, the government started a rape review 2 years ago to say how they were going to improve the stubbornly low statistics. And since they started that, 100,000 women have come forward to say that they have been raped. 2 years is too long to wait. And we're still waiting. We expect it in June. There are many things that we can do that would massively improve the incidents, the charging rates, and also conviction rates in rape and sexual violence. And yet, such as, for example, we could give legal support to a victim. Most people don't realise that if you are a victim, you don't have a lawyer. You are represented by the Crown. The Crown has a lawyer. They are not your representative. You are not in any way part of the system in the way that the perpetrator is, who is fully represented from the get-go. And there has been pilots in the north of England around offering end-to-end legal support to victims to go through the system that showed real promise. And so that is something that we would certainly be pushing for. But the just actual availability of specialist rape and serious sexual offences officers in every police force and every CPS unit, for example, where there is a patchy approach across the country, is just one area where that could be massively improved. But I won't go on too long. But in the sort of what can everyone do, which is the sort of question being posed by this conference, the reason that we don't progress in this area is there are a number of reasons. One is a government and resources based one, is that it is a huge problem. 1/3 of all police call outs are domestic abuse. 1/3 is the biggest single crime type in our country. Thousands and thousands and thousands of women come forward about domestic abuse and sexual violence in every local authority area across our country. But we never ever treat it like a volume issue. We don't treat it like we would treat diabetes in the NHS. Instead of offering insulin to prevent for all, what we do is we say, the 3 people who were entitled to the insulin came in this morning, so you've missed your chance. So there isn't a bed for you tonight. So, but I tell you what, we will give you one if you're going into a hypo. That's the way we that is the way we ration services, on the basis of risk in our country rather than on the basis of need. And while we do that, we will continue to see the number of women whose lives are taken by their intimate partners or a family member. We will continue to see it rise year on year. But in the what we can all do, and the thing that I have to challenge is the biggest challenge in an institution like Parliament, is we have all become much better versed in domestic abuse and sexual violence and talking about it. Everybody now can freely admit that they know somebody who, or talk even about their own experiences with less shame than there certainly was when I was a child. And I've watched in my time working in the field it go from being just a domestic to being considered to be a serious crime. So I have seen that progress of us able to talk about the victims. We will never progress and we will never change our laws until we can all recognise that every single one of us must know a perpetrator of this crime. because if everybody knows a victim, there's either 3 very prolific perpetrators across the country, or we all know and love somebody who has behaved in this way towards the women in our lives, who has behaved this way to women at work, who has behaved this way to women on the streets, who has behaved this way to women in their homes. And that is the thing that the people in the building where I work find. It's shocking, considering the stories about the place, that they find it difficult to challenge, because still in our institutions and in our governance, we still consider it worse to be accused of something than we do to think of what it would be like to be a victim of it. And until that flips and we start to learn to accept that we have got to do something about the perpetration of this crime, whether that's in education, whether that is in our own relationships, our own institutions. Universities are a good one. I've read too many case studies of he was a bright young lad and we didn't want to ruin his career. We have got to come to terms with how we as a people and as institutions manage that. And we are nowhere near. We are nowhere near. And that will be the thing that will help us challenge it in the future. And that, after the Sarah Everard killing, actually, I felt for the first time women saying, do you know what? We've done everything we can. You'll go. You have a go now. It's not my turn to do this anymore. It's men's turn to say why this has been happening. And until we deal with that, I'm afraid to say the numbers will continue to rise, the charging will continue to fall, the convictions will continue to fall, and we won't make the change that everybody wants to see.
Thanks, Jess. That was so powerful. You've raised the challenge, haven't you? You've given us data, not that we did not know, all of us know this, but you have set it out in its stark reality. And we have to think about what we can do more together. And the point about perpetrators is a really absolutely key one. Ask your questions to Jess. Ask your comments or make your comments. Let's go on now to our panelists. We're going to start with James Gale. Do you want to introduce yourself, Jim, and say what it is you do?
Yeah, certainly. It feels like quite a tough act to follow, doesn't it? Especially as a police officer. But I think it sets the context out. My role is the head of vulnerability for Devon and Cornwall Police. It's the new command. And it was established only in October, really to reframe some of the discussions on a broader piece, actually, not just around gender-based violence, although we will be picking up and are already actually picking up huge amounts in that space too. I suppose there are some elements of what we've just heard which I completely concur with, and almost feel a bit embarrassed to admit to. I don't think it's for lack of trying within police forces and the criminal justice partners, but for some reason the system is letting victims down, and I think we need some innovation, we need some focus, and we need some careful thinking about how we tackle it. But what I would say is I don't think it's purely down to the police and the CJ partners to resolve. There's something here about society and how society operates and what's acceptable and what isn't. And some of these behaviours start at a really low level. And I've not experienced this. I'm a man, but I would be able to identify with every single woman I know who's had some experience within the public space of being whistled at or on the receiving end of comment. Now that's at the lower end, but I think it says something about the behaviours that become normalised and acceptable in society and move through up into the much more serious end and some of the things that Jess has been talking about. I should just, I don't want to take up too much time. There are some things I just wanted to say that we're working on really hard at the moment. The issue of low levels of reported rape is a concern, real concern for us. Arguably, the point that Jess is making around the prosecution and conviction rates even more of a concern, because once we engage with victims and move into the criminal justice space, the really poor sort of rate of success, if I can call it that, we might have a discussion later about what success looks like. It is just such a worry for us. I mean, often when we get to court, the conviction rates are a bit better, but the whole business of getting to court's really poor. So there's some work going on in the force now under my command, which is looking at a really detailed tactical level. So each individual crime, what has happened here? Why hasn't it progressed? How has the victim been treated? What lessons might there be learned from this? Whereabouts are the CPS in this discussion? Are we engaging CPS early on around evidential criteria for successful conviction? And we are doing that with the assistance of independent advisors. This is a transparent, open process. I've used it before with hate crime, and there are always lessons to be learned. I mean, it does sometimes expose us a little bit to airing our laundry in public, but actually, my view would be, as a professional police organisation where we want to engage people who've been victims, engage their trust, that transparency, that openness is clearly critical and essential. So I could go on. I could go on and on and on. I won't. I'll stop. I think I've probably taken up my 2 or 3 minutes.
Thanks, Jim. And I think people will want to ask questions, and we can get a discussion going. Dawn Grant.
Hi there, everybody. So my name's Dawn. I work for an organisation called IDA, Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse. And we've been formed for a few years now, and we were formed by a lady called Elizabeth Filkin. Thank you for having me talking today, which is a real privilege, and lovely to see everybody here, and the outreach I'm sure will be fantastic. So what we do is we raise awareness within employers to help assist employees around domestic abuse. So how this came to light was that Elizabeth, who's the chair of IDA, raised an issue with the fact that when people go to work, they have their safe space. And if their safe space is removed, as it has been through lockdown, as it has been through the last 12, 15 months, domestic abuse is not being reported, but it can be dealt with by an employer if they are to know how to spot the signs and the symptoms and are able to assist their employee. So that's a little bit about what we do and how we do it. At the moment, we've got 850 members. We've got an outreach to over 6 million people, and we are working hard to increase that awareness as much as we possibly can. So what we do is it's a free membership. And we give toolkits, networking events, newsletters, updates, certainly on the domestic abuse bill we sent out to all of our members. And we just try to get as many people aware as we possibly can around domestic abuse and how employers can assist employees. So we do have a networking event, which is on Thursday of this week. If anybody would like to attend, please email me. I know that Shades has got the details for that. And yeah, we'd love to see you all there. But certainly, if anyone's got any queries or any questions around what I do and how we're trying to help tackle domestic abuse through employers, please do get in touch with me. That'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Dawn. And Elizabeth Filkin came to speak to our Women of Influence series, and that, she was fantastic. And thank you for telling us about IDA. Caroline Voden.
Hello everyone, my name's Caroline Voden and I'm the Chief Executive of Devon Rape Crisis and Sexual Abuse Services. So we're based in Exeter. We cover the whole of Devon and Torbay, and we offer professional specialised support to survivors of any kind of rape, sexual assault or sexual violence or sexual abuse. So it could be something that happened last month or something that happened 20 years ago. It doesn't matter to us. We support men and women, all genders, 13 plus, and we, as well as our face-to-face support work, which obviously hasn't been face-to-face for the past year, we've been offering it online. We are slowly heading back towards doing face-to-face work over the summer. We hope, fingers crossed. We also have a helpline which is open 3 times a week, an anonymous helpline, and we have an anonymous email support service as well, so people can contact us by email if they're too, if they don't want to pick up the phone. Some people find it easier to email, and we can have an anonymous email conversation. And we also offer some practical help for survivors, which we haven't been doing during the pandemic, but before that, for example, we could go with somebody to a legal appointment or to the police, or even to something like the dentist or a medical appointment if somebody was really struggling with doing that on their own. So we do offer that kind of service. And we see over 120 people every week. We have got a waiting list. Our referrals went up by at least 30% last year as we came out of lockdown, and they are still massively higher than any referrals numbers that we've recorded before. So it seems that we are now in a period of sustained much higher referrals, and we certainly saw a big spike after Sarah Everard was killed in London. So I think these kind of things are certainly triggering people to seek support for something that may have happened quite recently, but as I say, may have happened a long time ago. And we're hoping to move more, sort of, as well as doing all of that, we're hoping to develop our work around prevention and education, because obviously, you can support as many survivors as you possibly can, but if we're not doing work at the other end of the spectrum, then this problem is never going to change. So we do offer training in dealing with disclosures. I'm hoping that we'll be able to do some more work with schools, because it's something that schools are getting very nervous about now, that more people are going to be disclosing, and obviously teachers feel anxious about that. They're not trained to respond. It's a whole minefield for schools. It's new, it's quite worrying for them, so we are having conversations in Devon around that. We also have a course on sexual harassment in the workplace. So we're looking at offering our training out more widely to employers, to institutions, groups, clubs, across Devon and Torbay, just to try and help this conversation around what makes good, respectful relationships, healthy relationships, and how we can respond to something that is it's very clearly happening. It's happening everywhere. There is no school in the country now that can pretend there isn't a problem, because we all know that there is a problem and it's everywhere. And we're hoping to use our expertise and the voices of our service users to try and influence those conversations and make sure that we can, if we can't stop it happening, at least we can help people respond a little bit better when somebody has the courage to admit that it has happened. But happy to answer any questions about the help we offer. We have got a helpline number, but I don't think I can put it in the chat because we haven't got access to the chat, but happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Caroline. And there are some questions in the chat that I can see around wanting to access the Devon Rape Crisis Helpline and information about useful numbers. So we'll make sure that those are circulated. OK, can we go now to Meena Patel?
Hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak here today. I just wanted to add what Jess Phillips has said around the Domestic Violence Act and the bill, and leading up to that, one of the key areas that we have, along with Jess Phillips, is to try and ensure that the domestic violence bill actually had resources and a direction to helping migrant women in the country. And as we know, for years and years, we are beginning to see how migrant women are actually not afforded the same sort of help as those women who have the rights in the UK. And therefore, a lot of those women either are underground or too frightened to report to the police or to any other services for the fear of being deported, detained and then deported, or the fear of their children being removed. I'm a key worker. I've been at Southall Black Sisters for 36 years now, and I've worked in frontline, but currently now doing developmental and the finance manager at Southall Black Sisters. But my key role at the moment is working on the No Recourse Fund. I also set up the mental health service at Southall Black Sisters because I've recognised a gap in terms of culturally specific and a language that would be needed when counselling women, particularly Black and minority women, because back in the late 90s, there was an absence of that kind of service. So we developed a service through the Diana Memorial Fund and have that counselling service specifically for Black and minority women. And saying that we don't turn any woman away who comes to our door. We were established in 1979 with charitable aims and objectives. The bulk of our work, as I said, is with Black and ethnic minority women and children to ensure that their fundamental rights and freedoms in the face of gender-based violence, marginalisation and inequality. We have 40 years of experience of providing frontline service consisting of advice, advocacy, counselling and support service, as well as undertaking policy, strategic litigation, training and community development work and campaigning on issues highlighted by our core frontline advice and advocacy. We believe that in order to make change, it's really important to do not just frontline, but to actually make longer term changes, whether it's within the law or to have case law that we've changed. And some of the examples of that is that we brought about the Forced Marriage Protection Act. We also, in Kirinjit Ahluwalia in 1992, the criminal process of women who kill, which led to case law, and as a result led to many other women who were in prison who killed their violent partners to be released. And so it's, for us, the overarching aim of our service is to ensure that women and children live in safety and take control over their lives. And in order to achieve this, we have to deal with all the interrelated issues that come with the issues of domestic violence when women come to us about those issues. So we have to deal with other issues such as immigration, maybe child abuse. Sometimes it's to do with mental health, housing and so forth. So those are the kind of interrelated issues that we work on. But also, in what is unique about us, we're not just signposters, but we also work with the women very closely in ensuring, and like the other speaker said, they go with their clients to appointments. So where a woman just recently, she was very frightened of going for a hepatitis test, our advocates would go with her. And so we go to all their legal appointments, we support them through the court process and make sure they understand. And one of the things you have to remember that many of these women are traumatized, and to absorb some information is very difficult at the time when things are happening. They're frightened, they're scared, they don't know what's going to happen next to them. So it's really important for us as advocates to go along with them to ensure that they understand the process and the laws that's been explained to them, or the statement that's taken by the police. And what we tend to do is after that appointment, we will reiterate some of that so she starts to understand what the next steps are and how we are able to support her through that. It is about achieving confidence, skills, and about ensuring they are able to live independently. So we, as I said, we do provide counselling and support group, and we felt that it's really important to have the counselling as well, because if you cannot achieve results if you're not dealing with the social issues through counselling, because if they're constantly worried about their homelessness, the counselling will not be able to work, would not work for women, because they're at the back of their minds, they're still worrying. For example, even immigration, one of the highest things that we see is women who have uncertain immigration status are often very worried about what's going to happen to them day in and day out. At night, they're not able to sleep and things. And the worry is that many of them do attempt or contemplate suicide because of those fears. The fears, even after they get their right to remain, the fears that that's instilled in them by perpetrators, that they still can get them removed and deported from the country. And that takes a very long time in order to unravel and try and get the client to understand that that can't happen anymore. And so that's why we believe that counselling and support group work that we do helps them, will help through their advocacy work as well. And it is about overcoming religious, cultural taboos that pose risk and hold them back in their communities over the years. So it's really about allowing the powerless to have that power and to be able to voice their problems and things, both within the community as well as outside of the community. We also raise awareness and challenge harmful practices and traditional values that restrict women's autonomy. For example, in local schools, we have worked with girls to change attitudes around violence against women and gender. One of the interesting things before the lockdown was that I went to a local college to talk about domestic violence and our services to just raise the awareness. It was very interesting because the men came into the room first in a line, and then the women came in behind them. And as I spoke and gave them the information, I actually said on the table, we have leaflets and things, please do help yourself. And I was so surprised that in this day and age, a young lad got up and he turned around and he said to the women, we give you permission to take a leaflet. So that was quite worrying in seeing the way in which even now, how young men are controlling and patrolling on women and women's lives, and what they're entitled to look at and what they're not entitled to look at. We also provide a telephone advice line. Unfortunately, we don't get sufficient funding for 24/7, but they are open during the day. Our advice line is national and international because we also work with women who have been abandoned abroad and help them bring them back. We're one of the very few organizations that do that kind of work. Even where women who have taken abroad and killed in their home countries, we take up their cases to look at violence and abuse being a factor, and what are the legal steps that they can take or the family can take, both in the UK and abroad. So although our catchment is West London, we take on cases from where there are no other services, then we take on those cases as well. If it's practical, it does depend on that as well. Lastly, just to talk very quickly about our no recourse to public funds. We're funded by MOPAC to provide last resort funds to women who have immigration issues but need to escape violence and abuse. So we provide subsistence and accommodation cost for those women in London. The Home Office very recently has provided us with funding with 5 other partners in the UK to provide this fund to those women as well. So if you had a woman who had immigration issues, you're welcome to go onto our website and fill in route 1 of the application form, and we'd come back to you fairly quickly about whether your application's been approved.
Thank you very much for that. That was really brilliant to understand about the work of Southall Sisters. Can I move on now to Wahida Islam?
Hi, I don't know. So I'm Wahida. I'm the operations coordinator for Noor, and I'm also a senior psychotherapist. So I manage the counselling service at Noor, and also with another organisation called Women's Health and Family Services, where we work with survivors of FGM. With Noor, we work predominantly with the Muslim community. We were set up to kind of really tackle the issues of domestic abuse and abuse in general within the Muslim community, and to really look at the kind of internal barriers that people face in coming forward, but also the external barriers they face, and how difficult it can be to access sometimes mainstream services and how scary it can be. But over time, our work's kind of grown, and as Mina mentioned with Southall Black Sisters, it's the same with Noor. We don't turn anyone away. So we offer 24 sessions of free counselling. And part of that is because our organisation very much believes in being trauma informed, and you can't do trauma work in, like 6 sessions or 8 sessions. You need longer term counselling, and even with the 24, we often find that we have to extend it. And one of the things I think for us that we would say is the kind of consistent feedback that we get from clients coming to us is how wonderful it is for them to feel understood. So they say that often they go to organizations and they feel like they have to explain their culture or explain their faith, and it can become really exhausting. So, like before they can even talk about the abuse, they feel like they're kind of almost under attack. So they often say that it just feels great to be able to come somewhere and not have to kind of really explain ourselves. So I think one of the key things I would say for organizations is cultural competency. To be really, really culturally competent, to really think about someone's lived experience, and what that means for them is so important, and just being trauma informed. So one of the things we do is provide a wraparound service. So we have free legal advice, we have support services. And again, it's because often, when people are coming forward, they're dealing with so many different agencies and it becomes exhausting, so they want to come to somewhere where they feel safe. And I think that's the key thing, to have an organisation where they can feel really safe, really comfortable and not judged, where they can speak freely. So that's the kind of focus that we have at Noor, to kind of really have a very human approach to this. And I think that trauma-informed approach is just critical, whether we're talking about schools, universities, the workplace. I mean, I could go on and I won't because we're very short for time, but as a psychotherapist, the whole thing around even just the kind of fight, flight, freeze response within trauma, if people could just even begin to understand that within agencies and how that impacts people on a long-term basis, it would make such a fundamental difference for survivors of abuse. I just very, very quickly, we had a case recently where we had a client who's basically, she's got post-traumatic stress disorder, single mom, really trying to keep it together, facing a lot of abuse from her ex-husband through courts and other means. And she managed to get a job. And when she got the job and she let homelessness know that she got the job, they actually wrote to her and said, well, we don't think your mental health problems can be as bad as you're saying if you're managing to basically hold down this job. So rather than kind of support her and say, wow, this is great that you're getting your life together, it was almost like used against her, which was really appalling. But these are just, snippets of the kind of issues that people are having to deal with, and it's really overwhelming. So I think just having that trauma-informed approach is just absolutely critical, and obviously being culturally competent as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Wahida. It's great to hear you talk about safety and freedom to speak in safety as part of a trauma-based approach. We at the university are also doing a pilot with Georgetown University on cultural competence training, actually, for our staff. I think it's really important. Okay, going to go on now to Mia Terracent-Hill.
Hello, my name's Mia Tara. Can I just start by saying it's an absolute honour to be part of such a distinguished panel. My role is I'm the Women's Officer of the Falmouth and Exeter Students' Union, so I represent all Exeter-based students based in our Penryn and Truro campuses. And my role kind of works out to be working with local organisations, service providers, representing students and the student voices, especially of women and other kind of gender minorities, working with SU staff, including the SU Welfare President and Inclusivity President, and other kind of university staff, to make sure that issues affecting students who identify as female are kind of addressed. And a lot of the work I've been doing in the recent months in light of the Sarah Everard murder is to do with gender-based violence and making it an inclusive space both on campus and in the local community. Lovely to be here.
Thank you. Thanks, Mia Tara. Now we have got Lucy Wade and also Abigail Hartshorn. Let's start with Lucy.
So, hi, I'm a third year politics student at Exeter. I'm the current campaign manager for Recognise Red, which Abigail will tell you a bit about our work, how it was founded. But this year our campaign has been restricted to online events, but we've hosted discussion groups with feminist organisations in Japan to discuss gender-based violence, as well as a Q&A session with Beyond Equality, an important organisation reshaping perceptions of masculinity and challenging the culture that allows gender-based violence to thrive. So we're part of, there's so much work being done on campus by so many different bodies, and Recognise Red is essentially the student voice, which is a central element to like creating this change. So our organisation hopes to raise concerns from students to the university, while also educating other students on the changes that the university is making, and continue this student staff dialogue to help create a safer environment for everyone involved.
Thanks, Lucy. And Abigail Hartshorn. Can't hear you, Abigail. Can you unmute? I'm sorry. Yeah, you're live now. Yep, we can hear you. No, it's just muted again. Abigail, I'm going to go on to Rachel and then come back to you if there's time. So Rachel Fenton, can you introduce yourself and go on to talk about the pyramid of abuse?
Thanks very much. It's a wonderful panel, and I'm very privileged to be given some time to speak. I was asked to speak about the pyramid of abuse, which I'm going to do. I've been working around bystander intervention for the last sort of 5, 6, possibly longer years, and particularly interested in evidence-based prevention and evidence-based bystander programming training for people to be able to actually intervene, particularly at the lower levels when abuse is starting out, and changing that societal level context as well. And we run training courses as part of a spin out from the university around microaggressions in the workplace, thinking about all those cultural microaggressions, as well as specific trainings for universities, for sports clubs, and specifically on domestic abuse within communities. Next slide, please. So great honour to follow Jess Phillips, and she talked very much about response. She talked very much about the policy, the legislative picture, and problems within the criminal justice system, resources and organisations, and support for survivors. Response is really, really important, and I want to focus a little bit more on prevention. So thinking about what is going on in society, culture, those attitudes, that kind of cultural context, which allows things to be happening, and how we might start to think about prevention. And they work together. If you've got effective prevention, you've got to have a response to that. Equally, there's no point having a response if you haven't got people coming forward through good prevention. So it's really crucial, I think, that we remember that violence against women is a cause and a consequence of gender inequality, and that is where it all starts. Next slide, please. So thinking about that question of what can we do? One way that I think is quite useful to think about this is this idea of a river. So imagine a river, and we might say that at the mouth of the river, upstream, is what's going on, what's causing the violence, what's causing domestic abuse, sexual violence, how might we stop the people kind of falling in the river, if you like. Down the river, we respond to the outcome. People have fallen in the river, they've been pushed in the river, and we are fishing them out. We're throwing the life ring, if you like, and pulling them out of that river. Next slide, please. So keeping that idea of the river, you can kind of see how it kind of maps onto a triangle, which is at the mouth of the river, we've got a cultural or conducive context. That's the kind of upstream. That's where we need to think about prevention. And downstream is where the murder, the killing, the rape, the coercive control, and the serious harms are taking place. And that's where we need to think about kind of the response and how we're kind of taking people out and responding well. So that's you can see that kind of visual of the triangle. So this is what I really want to come on to explain a little bit more in detail. So next slide, thanks. As you can see, we're going to populate these it's like a series of building blocks that go from blue up to red. Okay, and it's what we want to think about is, what are the building blocks that take us through? Yeah, each one of these is a conducive context which allows the next layer or the next level up to take place. Okay, so at the very bottom of the pyramid, this is all about internal attitudes and beliefs. Okay, so these are the beliefs that many people hold within society. And these beliefs are fundamentally sexist and misogynistic views that women are worth less than men, they're less clever, they're less able, that they should look a certain way, they should be shaved, they should be wearing makeup, they should behave in certain ways. Okay, and when we don't behave in those ways, then they can be legitimately punished for doing so. Okay, so it's fundamentally dehumanizing, and this is where racism, transphobia, ageism, ableism, homophobia, all of those things fit as well. They're all attitudinal, they're all internally held. So part of this in terms of abuse might well be rape myths, for example. So myths like women lie about rape, that women do something to provoke rape, they deserve it, they've done something, that rape is accidental, it's not a choice, that, you know, the perpetrator didn't mean to, it was an accident, he accidentally got carried away. Yeah, they all are myths and internal beliefs. Okay, and these beliefs at the very bottom under attitudes and beliefs then are reinforced through exposure by those around them. So people who hear who hear and see and are exposed to people who believe the same things, they are reinforced, and they're reinforced by society as well. So if we think about representations of women within the media, social media, film, TV, popular culture, yeah, they reinforce these attitudes. Okay, these attitudes and beliefs then justify the next layer up. Yeah, when we think people are less equal, less human, then that justifies the cultural microaggressions. So shored up by people's internal attitudes is their manifestation within cultural microaggressions. Okay, so these are the expressions now of the attitudes. So they may be verbal expressions or they may be non-verbal. They are subtle and nuanced, and they can be unintentional and intentional, and they're normal behaviours, and they're normalised behaviours, sorry, not normal, normalised, that constitute the daily indignities that people who have less power in society are subject to. So these might be in your workplace campaigns that only show white men, for example. Simple as talking over women in meetings, talking over women in seminars, taking credit for other people's work, making assumptions about belonging, commenting on women's appearance in the workplace, calling women at work girls and not women. The banter, the jokes about sexual abuse, the sexist jokes, the sexual comments, gossip, negative gossip about people that plays on stereotypes, for example. So we see so many examples of these cultural microaggressions when we look at the everyday sexism accounts, for example, when we look at Me Too, when we look at the countless experiences of women at that kind of lower level, if you like. So sexist language, jokes, humour, all at the sort of cultural microaggression level. Okay, and some of those people may stay there and never progress past that, but other people may really internalise that sense of entitlement, and it leads them to actually deliberately and abusively make verbal expressions. So this is the much more specific, particularly abusive now expressions. So the catcalling, humiliation, name calling, sexual harassment, for example, where it's non-physical, and it may well be racialized. It may well incorporate lots of different forms of oppression within that. So those people with those prejudicial attitudes begin to verbalize those feelings of difference and superiority, intending to be abusive. Okay, many again may stay here. However, other people may take that further with that sense of entitlement and then indulge in the physical expression. So this might be the coercive control, the physical assault, the non-fatal strangulation that Jess talked about, certain sexual practices, rough sex, etc. But sexual harassment when it's physical rape and the physical assaults, etc. And again, you can see it's going down. So there are fewer people kind of engaging at this level. And then at the very top, of course, we've got homicide. So that right that these people lower down the pyramid are expressing their right to use power and violence over others, to control people that they don't see as equals, is justified by they deserve it. They're less human and they don't feel responsible. And that, therefore, the ultimate sort of dehumanizing is to legitimize the killing of somebody, because they're so dehumanized they don't value them. They're not worth anything. And what I really want to stress here is that the opportunities to intervene to prevent are much more likely at the bottom of the pyramid. Yeah, so all around us in everyday representations, we know what people think about things because we hear them verbalize it. Yeah, we hear these things, we see them, they're everywhere in our culture. We might talk about a rape culture, for example, and those opportunities are therefore at the bottom of the pyramid. The chances of being physically present when a rape or a murder is taking place are a lot less, but the chances of hearing sexist banter are very high at the bottom of the pyramid. And so that's the challenge, is how do we equip people to begin to challenge at the bottom of the pyramid? And a really good way to think about it is like this. These are people kind of shoring up other people who take it further, right to the very top. So what we need to do, in the next slide please, is if we start to dismantle those beliefs, those attitudes right at the bottom, the cultural microaggressions, we take people out of that, we stop them shoring up others, then we start to dismantle the pyramid. And that is what prevention is all about, dismantling the attitudes, beliefs, the cultural microaggressions. And if we can do that, then we start to dismantle the sense of entitlement and justification that shores up the most kind of serious forms of abuse, or those with the most serious outcomes. And that's where my interest in bystander intervention comes in. How do we get everybody to feel responsible at the lower level? Thank you.
Sweet. That was clear. So I'm getting some feedback. So can you keep mic switched off? Thank you. Really clear presentation, Rachel. And I want to come on to what you were saying there. But the first question I'm going to ask is actually first for Jess, which is how do perpetrators use the courts to harass victims?
Well, very successfully is the answer. Firstly, if you were to consider the criminal courts in our country can be horrendously traumatizing for victims of abuse, and it's probably one of the single reasons why most women don't come forward, because actually the sort of experience of a courtroom, regardless of the amount of special measures that have been put in place in the criminal courts over the years, it is still a harrowing experience where, for example, even though I'm told repeatedly that it doesn't happen, and have sat through court cases where it does happen repeatedly, women will be asked to explain their previous sexual history, for example, as a indicator of their character. And the expectation of women's character in a courtroom is very different to the expectation of a man, to go to some of the stuff that Rachel was saying, the expectations of how I live my life versus how my husband lives his life, and what would be considered. The best example I can ever think of this is, do you think that I would be a member of parliament if I had 6 children with 3 different men, one of which I'd abandoned? The answer is it's a hard no. And yet the Prime Minister of our country managed to become the Prime Minister. So we have different expectations of men and women with regard to their behaviour, and that is often used in a courtroom. And it's harrowing for victims, and they think it of themselves often, and then we collude with them. But what I was talking about was how the civil courts can be used, and how and the family courts in our country are they are very secretive is one of the main problems, and so there is not really eyes, so journalists can't report on it in the same way. So when you see in the newspaper some judge has said some terrible comment, everybody reacts and we all write to the Attorney General. That happens in the criminal courts. That does not happen in our family courts, because they are very, very secretive, and so the level of scrutiny about what is happening in them and the difference between the way men and women get treated is almost unknown, apart from those who come forward and tell us. But also there is very little on limitations of the amount of times a perpetrator of domestic abuse can keep taking their victim to court. And I've seen it in both the family courts, just repeatedly seeking access to their children, just for the sake of the process. Of taking a woman through a very harrowing process where she is judged as a parent, and she is judged usually for allowing her child to live with that perpetrator. She will be judged for that, more so than he will be judged for committing violence against her. And I have my computer open now. I have in my inbox, I have one folder in my inbox that's just family court cases, and in that inbox is thousands of case studies of women who have been through this situation. We have a thing in our country which I am seeking to overturn, which they didn't put into the domestic abuse bill, of the presumption of contact. It was put into the Children's Act some 10 years ago, that there is a presumption that the best thing for a child is to be seen and have support from both their parents, and that presumption of contact has been used very, very, very dangerously. There is a part of the law, regulation 12J, that says that where there is domestic abuse, that should be overridden, the presumption of contact, and yet in 90% of cases that I have seen, it is not overridden. And people say, I've watched women talk about being raped by their partner while their children watched, and still it being considered that it would be better for the child to have a relationship with that father. Now, in my view, if you are a domestic abuser, you are, and if you know, people are, and women do this amazing thing where they say, he was awful to me, but he wasn't a bad dad. I've heard that a million times in my career, and I have all sympathy for that, but my response will always be, any dad who beats up the mom is a bad dad. The end.
Thanks, Jess. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but I want to ask Jim the same question around what's your view, Jim, about how perpetrators use the courts to harass victims? And could I also ask you another question, which is, what's the training that the police have about the psychology behind abuse, the kinds of things that Rachel was talking about in her analysis?
Okay, so I won't cover off some of the ground that Jess has, but I do think, and I hinted at it in my introduction, I do think that the criminal justice system per se frequently doesn't serve victims well. So the length of time between reporting an incident and appearing in court can sometimes be extremely long. So people have undergone, you know, a period of recovery and you know, moving on in their life, only then to have to repeat the story in a court of law. So I think there are some issues with the way in which the criminal justice system works, which doesn't support victims terribly well, and I think that acts as a disincentive for people to report. I also think that that is a system but it touches different organisations, and different organisations have different ways of operating. So the sort of way in which victims pass through the system means that they pass through lots and lots of different people. They often have to retell their story over and over again. They have to deal with their own life at the same time, deal with recovery at the same time, and may not measure success in a conviction. Frequently, though, police forces and the Crown Prosecution Service will do. When I talk to victims, and victims of really quite serious crime, often the biggest impact is the way they are treated, particularly at the beginning. So it's the empathy, it's the compassion, it's being listened to, it's being taken seriously, it's being helped, provided with additional support. All of those things, in my experience, are the things that are often the things that make the biggest difference to people in their lives and recovering from this type of trauma. However, it's often not the thing that we measure success by. So we will, and we've heard it this afternoon, we tend to measure our success through whether we've had a successful prosecution or a successful conviction, and then move on. It's an easy measure, but it doesn't really take account of the impact of these things on people's lives, either at the time or afterwards, which I think leads me into your second question, which is about the training that officers and staff have around these types of issues. One of the things that we're trying to do within the Vulnerability Command is to address the way the organisation thinks and reacts to these things across the entire organisation. So not just within my command, which currently consists of custody, criminal justice, victim services, and the prevention directorate. And I recognise quite a lot of what we've just discussed around that triangle. What we're trying to do is move into a much more trauma-informed approach, where officers and staff do have that empathetic ear, do take seriously the things they're being told, may not necessarily be able to provide a solution there and then, but are able to compassionately take some time to listen to victims and listen carefully to what they have to say. We're moving towards that literally as we speak. We'll be rolling out some training to frontline staff and to others, supervisors and so on, to help that trauma-informed approach. Where it becomes challenging is we shouldn't forget that all of our staff are also human beings. They are dealing 24/7 with traumatic incidents. We ask them to go to, and Jess made reference to some figures, but we're asking them to go repeatedly to domestic violence, to assaults, to violence, to suicides, to road traffic accidents. These are things which are traumatic and cause trauma to our staff. Truthfully, the only way we can move towards a compassionate and empathetic response, which really puts the victim at the heart of our thinking, is to maximise the opportunity for staff to be compassionate and empathetic, which means that what we try and do has to walk hand in hand with our health and well-being strategies. We can't get rid of it completely, but there are things that we can do.
Okay, thank you. And back to Jess. This is a question which is anticipating that universities will not act in cases of sexual violence between students, which they will do. But the point is that it is regarded as this is an issue for the police. In the US, there is Title IX, which allows universities to act independently. I guess the question really is around what should universities be doing in terms of alleged sexual violence involving two students?
Yeah, so first to cover off the first issue you said, where this is a matter for the police, is literally the mantra of almost all organisations who don't want to do anything. Because often I think, you know what, this is not even necessarily a matter for the police, but even if it was, it doesn't mean it's not a matter for you. It gets said in Parliament all the time, well, if they've got a problem, they should go to the police. If they've got a problem, but the reality in the criminal justice system, which, you know, is not something that I would want to undermine ever, because I believe in a fair defence and a system where we don't have innocent people going to prison, is, you know, there is basically a 90% proof positive threshold for the criminal justice system, and it has to be proven beyond reasonable doubt, whereas institutions have the opportunity to investigate on the balance of probabilities, and that is what they should all do, regardless of what the police action is being taken. A very recent thing that I've noticed happening in schools, in universities, in the place where I work, and in other institutions, is they say, oh, we can't do anything while there's a police investigation going on, and there's this whole, and all of it is just kicking things into the long grass because it's too difficult to deal with. And what I was saying in my remarks about knowing a perpetrator, so often the problem for universities, for workplaces, is that they're not just dealing with a victim. Just dealing with a victim, there is obvious pathways, you know, that you could be, universities can offer specialist support from an organisation like Caroline's, and can fund a proper pathway for students to have access to independent sexual violence advisors and counselling should they come forward, and basically handing that over to specialist providers to deal with it. The problem comes when the perpetrator is also the responsibility of that employer, that university, that and it becomes, and people are terrified of litigation, as they absolutely should be, because one of the chilling effects that I've seen recently is people issuing cease and desist letters on people who, a woman who talked about how her boyfriend, didn't even say his name, had strangled her on Facebook, and she was issued with a cease and desist letter about speaking about her own experiences. So universities and institutions are going to find themselves in some of these difficult situations. I don't undermine that it is difficult. So there needs to be absolutely proper, robust, independent investigation facilities available to look very, very carefully at the balance of probabilities, and that's what we've had set up in Westminster. So we have an independent panel of QCs, and one time, I mean, fair enough, Parliament has got access to some good people, High Court judges and things, and they sit and do the investigations and the appeals with the help of specialists. And that is what needs to be in place in big institutions, is to do proper, independent, non-biased investigations and judge on the balance of probabilities, supporting both parties throughout.
The guidance for universities, which used to be known as the Zealot guidelines, changed in 2016, which actually said hand it over to the police and forget about it. Actually, our university can and will and does act on this, and we have our sexual misconduct policy that will actually guide what we're doing. So we would expect in a university investigation and a police investigation to proceed in parallel. So it isn't anything that we would wash our hands of. It's really important not to do that. I want to go on to a question for Rachel quickly around public places at night time. Have there been any bystander initiatives that have been successful in helping to address risks in the nighttime economy?
In short, there is, not that I've been involved with, but there have been campaigns. For example, Drink Aware did one around sexual harassment, where it was kind of, it's okay to ask. So there have been some campaigns around the nighttime economy, and I know that in some regions there have been trainings for bouncers, for taxi drivers, that kind of thing. So there's been a lot of activity around the nighttime economy, but in terms of being a bystander, not specifically. Of course, it would be something that we cover when we look at universities, but that's sort of in terms of if you see it between people or out in clubs, etc., that you know how, you know, safe ways to interrupt and distract within those, but nothing that's actually specifically and only targeted at people within the nighttime economy.
Okay, thanks. Many survivors don't identify their experiences as violent or abusive until after the relationship ends. How do we support people to recognise this? So who would like to come in on that? Wahida.
Hi, I think one of the things that we found really helpful and working as a psychotherapist is for people to see the cycle of abuse. That can be really powerful, because there's the whole thing of kind of going through the abuse and then being drawn back into it. You know, there's so many statistics about how many times people leave an abusive relationship and so on. So I think it's often, you know, to be able to visualize that cycle of abuse and to be able to see that actually even the kind of, you know, when they're behaving nicely is part of that cycle, and it's kind of almost designed to draw people back in, can be really powerful. Because you know, when someone's being nice, then it's almost like, oh well, he's changed and things are going to be different now, and you know, he won't do it again, and he's apologized. And you know, so there's a very powerful infograms that you can get around the cycle of abuse, I think, which really help. And just recognizing, you know, the different types of abuse. So it's almost like, well, he didn't hit me, so it's not that bad, you know, or he just shouted a bit, and you know, and they don't recognize it as abuse. So I think starting to kind of have more, you know, information out there that says these are all the different types of abuse, you know, and coercive abuse, and you know, financial abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse. So really starting to recognize the different forms of abuse, and having that information more readily accessible for people, because it is, you know, the entire sense of self is destroyed in those abusive relationships. You know, people's confidence, you know, sometimes people say, oh, you know, I would never have thought that she would have been in an abusive relationship. She was always so strong. She was always so this. But, you know, it's like almost like it's eroded over time, that sense of self. And it takes a long time for people to rebuild that sense of self, to start trusting their intuition. There's obviously also things around fear and safety. You know, how safe do they feel coming forward? You know, what if they're in an abusive relationship, where will they go afterwards if they leave? You know, so there's so many questions. We've had one of the things that issues that come up for us is a lot of refugees won't take people, you know, people with more than 2 children. They've only got space for a mother and 2 children. So someone's got like 3 children, 4 children. What are they meant to do? There's so many limited spaces in refuges. So things like that can be a huge concern for people. You know, where am I going to take my children? You know, is it going to be safe? So all these sorts of things. I mean, there's so much more, but that's just kind of like a brief response.
Thank you. And Caroline wants to come in, and then I'm going to try and squeeze one more question in. Caroline?
Yeah, just very briefly, just echoing what Wahida said about education. One of the things we see at Devon Rape Crisis and Sexual Abuse Services is that some people will come to us not having realised that they'd been a victim of sexual violence. You know, there's one of the classics would be an older woman who didn't realise that rape within marriage was rape, you know, and just assumed that was what happened in a marriage, and that her husband was entitled to sex. And you know, our oldest service user is 84. So we do have people who, you know, who want to deal with something that might have happened a very long time ago, but they've only just sort of recently been able to identify it and name it, and then they realise that's what happened to me, and you know, and then they can seek some support for it. But I think it you know, this is why it's so important to start educating early, so that people grow up with this knowledge of what's acceptable, and what counts as sexual violence, and you know, what is a healthy relationship. I just want to go back very briefly to the Title IX thing, because I have I'm aware of somebody who went through Title IX 2 years ago while on a year abroad in America, and quite a frightening thing to have to do as a student, but much less frightening than having to deal with the state police in the United States. And, you know, it was a really formal procedure, and it took a long time. But at the end of it, the boy was kicked out of the university. And it seemed to me to be a really good, you know, her comparison of that to what was available in the UK was that this was a really proper, clear, managed procedure with very strict sort of rules about how it was all investigated. And she felt at the end that there had been some kind of justice, even though, you know, there was no criminal justice, but, you know, there was a bit of an outcome, and it seemed to me that it was a good thing.
It'll be good for us, I think, to actually do a strict comparison with Title IX with what we do here. But I do know that actually Title IX has been misused and turned back on itself in terms of the outcomes in the US. Be good for us to look at that. I want to have one last question to all of you, which is around trans women frequently experiencing misogynistic violence. What can we do to offer meaningful support? Anyone want to take that? Abigail, and then Mia. Oh, we're still having problems with your mic, Abigail. Let's go on to Mia.
I think a really important thing to kind of combat some of the misogynistic violence that trans people do face is by making being transgender, make it a very inclusive experience within the university. I think there's a lot of steps the university itself can take to kind of normalise being transgender, one of which is pronouns on Teams, which I have brought up with quite a few people at the university, and it is something that is quite difficult to implement for various technical reasons. But I think making it an inclusive experience is really, really important, especially if there kind of maybe aren't as many people that you identify with on campus, creating those support networks so that if something does happen, you know what the procedure is and you know you're going to be supported. I think a lot of anxiety comes from people feeling like they don't know who to turn to, and they don't think the university can deal with an issue when it does rises. And as we've heard from this panel, there's so much the university can do. I think that the messaging of what support is available, and if the right type of support isn't available, expanding the services to support whatever experience a student is going through.
Thanks, Mia. And I think we do have to end it there. We have had so many questions, and we could have gone on for the rest of the evening and beyond into tomorrow. But I'd really like to thank our speakers, especially Jess Phillips MP, for everything that they've done, actually not only in terms of this afternoon, but actually what they're doing in terms of their day-to-day lives. And there is some really powerful lessons for us. I think we all share this notion of a trauma-informed approach, and we can work in partnership to give each other, I think, better support. So thanks to you all for joining this afternoon, and I hope you have a good end of day and week. Thank you all very much. Bye.